It all started with the smell of hickory-smoked brisket, floating lazily through the pine-covered hillside while my family and I gathered at our cabin for what we hoped would be a peaceful long weekend. The weather was perfect, the fire pit was glowing with just the right amount of flame, and the laughter of my nieces echoed through the trees while my brother and I tended to the grill. But peace never lasts long when you live under the thumb of a corrupt HOA and an even worse neighborhood tyrant who calls herself Director Margaret. If you've ever dealt with HOA Karens, you already know what I mean. Clipboard warriors, self-appointed rule enforcers, and in this case, an HOA willing to commit serious crimes just to assert power. And if you're new here, buckle in. This story isn't just about rules and fines. It's about impersonation, corruption, and a BBQ that ended in a firefight with federal agents. This is your sign to subscribe to Sham Stories right now, because what you're about to read is too wild for fiction, and it's absolutely true. Our cabin was technically within HOA boundaries, but it was far enough out of the gated neighborhood that most owners didn't bother us until Margaret got elected. She wasn't just annoying, she was obsessive. Over the last year, she had tried everything from trespassing to unauthorized drone surveillance, just to prove we were violating fire safety codes. With our weekend cookouts, she had already sent cease and desist letters through the HOA attorney, which we countered through our own legal team. I'm a civil rights lawyer, my brother is a retired prosecutor, and my wife is ex-FBI. Margaret didn't know all that, of course. She just thought we were arrogant homeowners who needed to be taught a lesson. That weekend, the lesson came with fake badges, loaded guns, and a plan so reckless it nearly got everyone killed. It started when two black SUVs rolled up the gravel path to our cabin. Just after 5 p.m., 3 men stepped out in tactical vests. With the word police emblazoned on the front in blocky white letters, they wore sunglasses, utility belts, and carried sidearms, but their demeanor was all wrong. One was too jittery, the other too aggressive, and none of them announced a department. They didn't flash real badges, just black leather wallets with shiny circular emblems I'd never seen before. We got a call about illegal burning, one of them barked, looking at our smoker and the controlled flame in the fire pit. This area is under fire watch, and we need to inspect the premises. I immediately stepped forward, adrenaline, pumping, eyes locked on their belts. Which agency are you with? I asked. No answer. My wife, Sarah, was already moving toward the cabin, probably to get her service firearm and check her contacts. The men started spreading out, one moving toward our storage shed, another eyeing the back of the property. I need to see a warrant, I said again, louder now. This is private property, the lead guy grinned and said. The HOA gave us authorization. That's when I knew they weren't cops. They were actors, security guards, or worse, armed imposters, sent by Margaret to do God knows what. Motioned subtly to my brother, who pulled out his phone and began recording. You're trespassing, I warned. This entire property is under surveillance. That's when things turned ugly. One of them reached for his holster and shouted, "Step back!" At that exact moment, a black SUV came barreling down the same gravel road, kicking up dust. It screeched to a halt just past the BBQ pit, and out jumped a real agent's tactical gear, earpieces, and the unmistakable blue FBI jackets. "Drop your weapons," one of them yelled. The 3 fake cops froze, stunned. But the idiot near the shed decided to run. He turned and darted behind the cabin, and the moment he did, the real agents moved. It happened fast, too fast to even process. One agent tackled the man at the smoker, while the other chased down the runner. My wife emerged from the cabin, firearm holstered, badge clipped to her belt, shouting to the agents that she was ex-bureau. In under 90 seconds, all 3 men were on the ground, cuffed, disarmed, and being read their rights. My nieces were crying, my brother was pale, and the BBQ was now surrounded by federal agents and squad cars that arrived minutes later. As the scene calmed and statements were taken, the truth began to unravel, and it was worse than we thought. Those men weren't just impersonating law enforcement. They were hired contractors from a private firm out of state, paid under the table by the HOA board. The directive was intimidation and compliance. The agents told us they had been tracking these guys for a few weeks after a tip-off from an anonymous whistleblower. The moment they arrived on our property under false pretense, the Bureau moved in. And that's just the beginning. What Margaret didn't know was that her digital paper trail was already in the FBI's hands. And the raid on her home the next morning would uncover even more damning evidence of conspiracy, extortion, and impersonation. But I'll get to that. Because what happened after the takedown, the legal battle, the media frenzy, the complete dismantling of the HOA board would become one of the most high-profile homeowner cases in state history. After the chaos at our cabin barbecue, the aftermath unfolded like something out of a legal thriller. Only this wasn't fiction, it was our real life, and we were just getting started. As the dust settled and the FBI processed the scene, agents from the local field office fanned out to question everyone on the property, gathering statements from me, my wife Sarah, my brother Mike, and even our shaken nieces. Sarah, being former Bureau herself, was immediately pulled aside by a supervising agent named Dawson, a man she apparently had worked with years earlier. That connection sped up everything. Within an hour, we were sitting at our kitchen table. With two agents who laid everything bare, the trio of fake cops weren't just impersonators, were operatives from a shady private security group based in Arizona. A group known for offering compliance enforcement to HOAs and private clients under the radar. The contract, as it turned out, had been traced directly to Margaret and the HOA's slush fund account. The agents showed us partial files they had already seized through a wiretap warrant, executed on the HOA's internal communications network. That was when I saw it. My name, my wife's name, even photos of our property from drones and trail cams that didn't belong to us. We were being watched, profiled, and targeted, and Margaret was behind it all. We were outraged, of course. But more than that, we were determined. As a civil rights attorney, I had handled dozens of cases involving illegal surveillance and harassment, but never had one landed quite so close to home. Sarah, with her contacts in federal law enforcement, got a direct line to the assistant U.S. attorney who was now overseeing the criminal investigation. That same night, we were informed that a sealed warrant had been approved for a federal raid. On Margaret's home and the HOA clubhouse at dawn, I barely slept. When the sun rose over the pines the next morning, we were already on the back porch with hot coffee and binoculars, watching as unmarked vehicles rolled through the quiet suburban street 3 miles down from our cabin where Margaret's gated community sat smugly unaware. The raid wasn't dramatic. No gunfire, no chaos, but it was efficient. Margaret was pulled from her bed in a silk robe, handcuffed in front of her manicured lawn, while agents carried out boxes of documents, hard drives, and even a hidden server that had been stored in the HOA's underground maintenance room. Word spread fast, and within hours the neighborhood was buzzing. Margaret had always painted herself as a land order type. The moral compass of the HOA, the protector of property values and community decency. To see her hauled off like a common criminal shattered the illusion for dozens of residents who had never dared to challenge her authority. But it didn't stop there. Over the next 48 hours, the FBI and DOJ released a preliminary statement, confirming the arrest of 4 individuals, the 3 fake cops and Margaret, and the seizure of over $300,000 in illicit HOA funds. The story went viral. Local news reporters camped outside the HOA clubhouse, interviewing neighbors who, up until then, had either feared Margaret or followed her blindly. But now, skeletons were tumbling out of every closet. It turned out that our family wasn't the only one targeted. The FBI's forensic team uncovered dozens of illegally recorded conversations, unauthorized drone footage of residents in their yards, and a secret blacklist Margaret had maintained of homeowners she deemed problematic. The names included a disabled veteran who had refused to move his American flag, a single mother who held yoga classes on her lawn, and an elderly couple fined repeatedly for non-regulation garden gnomes. We weren't just fighting for ourselves anymore. We were fighting for everyone. Margaret had abused with her fake authority and pathological obsession with control. That week, Sarah and I filed a joint federal civil suit against the HOA board and Margaret individually. Mike joined as a co-plaintiff. Our case alleged civil rights violations, conspiracy to intimidate, illegal surveillance, impersonation of law enforcement, and emotional distress. It wasn't just about damages, though. We were seeking those too. It was about setting a legal precedent for homeowners across the country dealing with rogue HOA boards that crossed the line from governance to tyranny. The days that followed, our phones rang nonstop. Media outlets wanted interviews, advocacy groups reached out to support our case, and neighbors who had once been silent suddenly found the courage to speak up. One woman confessed that Margaret had threatened to revoke her clubhouse access if she didn't spy on a neighbor's fence renovations. Another man admitted he had been fined $500 for excessive grilling smells and had been forced to appear in a fake HOA court Margaret had constructed in the basement of her home. The deeper we dug, the worse it got. With Sarah's help, and her contact still inside the bureau, we uncovered a money laundering ring hidden within the HOA's vendor accounts. Margaret had been issuing inflated maintenance contracts to shell companies owned by her brother and pocketing the excess. It was a racket, and it had gone on for nearly 6 years undetected. The more we revealed, the more the case grew from a single confrontation at a BBQ to a full-blown federal investigation into one of the most corrupt HOAs in the state. What really shocked us was how close Margaret had come to getting away with it all. If not for that anonymous tip, if not for the reckless overreach of sending fake armed officers onto our property, if not for Sarah's sharp instincts and our family's legal background, this would have gone down as just another weekend hassle by HOA bullies, but they pushed too far. They stepped onto our land with lies and guns, and they underestimated who they were dealing with. And now, with the court case growing, the FBI's investigation expanding, national attention fixed on our story, the real reckoning was only beginning. Asterisk. The shockwave of Margaret's arrest rippled far beyond our quiet mountain community, reaching all the way to state regulatory boards and national HOA watchdog groups that had previously ignored the mounting complaints about overreach. We didn't even have time to process everything before subpoenas began landing on every board member who had served under Margaret in the past 5 years. To our surprise, many of them cracked almost immediately. Turns out, the culture of fear and silent compliance Margaret had fostered extended into her own board. It had signed off on surveillance budgets, allowed secret votes, and enforced fake bylaw amendments because they feared retaliation fines. Or even slanderous newsletters Margaret routinely mailed to all residents shaming those who opposed her. But now, with the federal spotlight burning through the HOA's shadowy operations, these once loyal lieutenants were flipping on her left and right, handing over key cards, passwords, documents, and even audio recordings of board meetings where Margaret openly discussed removing resistance by force if necessary. Some of the content was so disturbing that the FBI looped in federal prosecutors to investigate whether the HOA had violated RICO statutes, a serious charge typically reserved for organized crime. Margaret's actions had transformed a neighborhood association into a pseudo-authoritarian regime with its own surveillance, enforcement arm, financial schemes, and coordinated silencing of dissent. It was far beyond mere mismanagement. Our family, meanwhile, was thrust into the center of a media firestorm. We didn't ask for it, but we embraced it. I gave interviews on national news networks about HOA abuse. Sarah spoke on behalf of homeowners, rights organizations, and Mike joined forces with civil liberties lawyers across the country to draft a proposed bill that would regulate the powers of HOAs at the state level. We were turning our ordeal into a movement. The more we shared, the more emails poured in, hundreds, then thousands, from families all over America with similar stories. HOA board members pretending to be police, enforcing illegal rules, issuing bogus fines, using intimidation tactics, and invading people's privacy. It was like we'd uncovered a nationwide infection, and we were now the accidental surgeons. But in the middle of all that public momentum, we still had to deal with the very real trauma our family had endured. My young nieces, who had witnessed the armed impersonators storm our BBQ, were still having nightmares. Sarah had to hold a debriefing session with an FBI trauma psychologist who helped them process what had happened. As a former federal agent herself, Sarah carried a unique burden. Part of her felt responsible for not spotting the threat sooner, but no one blamed her. If anything, we were lucky she was there. Had she not instinctively reacted and identified the fake credentials and body language of the imposters, they could have caused real harm before the FBI even arrived. It turned out those three men had a documented history of violent behavior under the guise of private enforcement. One had once tried to forcibly detain a teenager over a skateboarding violation in a gated neighborhood in Phoenix. That case had been settled quietly, but now it was being reopened. Margaret had handpicked these thugs for their intimidation factor, and now her choices were adding federal assault and conspiracy charges to her growing rap sheet. At the same time, the HOA tried to go into survival mode. The remaining board members called an emergency town hall to announce their full cooperation with authorities and distance themselves from Margaret's crimes. They even posted an apology letter on the community website, but it was too little too late. Residents wanted blood, and several families immediately moved to dissolve the HOA altogether. A legal petition was drafted citing corruption, criminal activity, and widespread abuse of power. Sarah and I supported it fully. The community didn't need a governing body run like a dictatorship. They needed transparency, mutual respect, and simple rules that didn't require secret agents or gunmen. In the midst of all this, our civil suit was gaining momentum. A federal judge had fast-tracked the case after reviewing sealed affidavits from FBI agents detailing the scope of the HOA's illegal surveillance. Discovery brought even more dirt to the surface, including an internal email thread between Margaret and a so-called security strategist she hired through a dark web-adjacent consulting group, where they openly discussed how to break the resolve of families like ours. They spoke in coded language, but it was clear what they meant: psychological warfare against dissenting homeowners. The moment our attorney read those emails aloud in court, the judge ordered a restraining order against the HOA and placed all of Margaret's assets under temporary freeze. Our team of lawyers, including myself, Sarah, and two colleagues from my firm, prepared for a brutal trial. But behind the scenes, pressure was building for a massive settlement. The HOA's insurance provider had already threatened to drop their policy, and dozens of homeowners had filed individual claims citing harassment and emotional trauma. We knew they'd offer a payout to make it all go away. But for us, it wasn't about money, not primarily. We wanted reform. We demanded new bylaws written with federal oversight, external audits for the next decade, and a complete dissolution of the private enforcement contracts that had fueled this nightmare. Most of all, we wanted an official acknowledgement of wrongdoing, in writing, to be made public. As those negotiations dragged on, the FBI wrapped up its own investigation and released a report summarizing what they'd found. It was jaw-dropping. Margaret had funneled over $500,000 through fake repair invoices, used private drones to spy on residents' backyards, hacked into several homeowners' Wi-Fi networks, and most damning of all, had trained her fake officers using footage from real police body cams stolen from a data leak years prior. She had studied real cops' movements and language to help her enforcers blend in. The level of premeditation was staggering, and it left no doubt that this was a deliberate, malicious operation. The DOJ followed up with formal indictments, not just for Margaret and her hired thugs, but for the shadowy consultancy she had used. The charges included impersonating federal officers, unauthorized surveillance, racketeering, and conspiracy to deprive civil rights under color of law. Margaret's empire had officially crumbled. For us, it was a strange mix of vindication and lingering unease. We had won a huge battle, but the war for homeowners' rights was just beginning. And even with all the media attention, legal victories, and personal satisfaction, there was still a bitter truth lingering in the air. If the wrong family had been targeted that night at the cabin, if a different homeowner without Sarah's background had faced those armed imposters, this story could have ended in tragedy. We were lucky, yes, but we were also ready, and now we were determined to make sure no other family would ever need to be. The media firestorm that followed was something we hadn't anticipated, even after all that had already happened. Satellite trucks lined the roads near both the HOA clubhouse and our cabin entrance. and drones buzzed above for aerial shots while reporters angled for interviews and neighbors scurried around whispering about subpoenas. But we kept our heads down and focused on the legal strategy, because the real work was only beginning. Sarah coordinated directly with the assistant U.S. attorney, who informed us that they had now formally expanded the investigation into an organized criminal enterprise under the RICO Act. That was huge. It meant not only would Margaret and the fake cops face federal time, but anyone involved in the conspiracy, board members, security contractors, and even HOA attorneys who turned a blind eye were now targets we started hearing about. More people flipping, providing evidence to avoid indictment, including a former HOA treasurer who confessed that Margaret had used HOA funds to fly out of state for what she called compliance conferences, but were in fact luxury trips with her accomplices. It was surreal watching it all unfold, while still managing our normal lives at the cabin. My brother Mike set up surveillance, just in case anyone else tried anything stupid. Sarah began compiling a timeline of all HOA harassment that we and others had experienced, while I reached out to other homeowners through secure online channels to prepare for a class action suit. Our phones pinged non-stop with messages of support from families we barely knew, people who had been quietly bullied for years but never spoke up until now. We even heard from a retired federal judge who lived 5 streets down from the clubhouse, and admitted that Margaret once threatened to fine him for letting his dog off leash on a Tuesday. "I've been waiting for someone to burn that little dictatorship to the ground," he said. We were more than happy to be the spark, but things escalated in ways we never imagined. One night, about a week after Margaret's arrest, we were woken by the sound of tires crunching on gravel, someone driving up to the cabin. At nearly 2 a.m., I grabbed my flashlight and a sidearm and stepped out onto the porch. What I saw made my stomach drop. A large black SUV had stopped halfway up our drive, engine running, no lights, just idling there like a predator waiting for something. Sarah was already behind me, firearm drawn and ready. Mike flanked the back window with a tactical flashlight. And within seconds, we heard the telltale chirp of police radios, but these weren't real officers. The SUV spun its tires and reversed so fast it nearly hit a tree, disappearing into the woods before we could get a plate. We called it in immediately. By sunrise, a full mobile FBI unit was parked outside the cabin. Agent Dawson, clearly rattled, confirmed that someone had broken into the temporary evidence storage unit back at the HOA clubhouse and stolen a file marked classified witness testimony. Sarah and I were both listed in that file, along with GPS coordinates to the cabin. It wasn't just a scare tactic, it was a hit attempt. The agents assigned us protective detail immediately, and Sarah's old bureau contacts launched an internal probe to find out how the breach occurred. Meanwhile, the HOA's former vice president, a man named Stanley Finch, went public with a shocking admission. He had signed off on nearly half of the private security expenditures over the past 2 years, thinking it was for basic patrols and community enforcement. He hadn't realized Margaret was using the funds to hire armed impersonators, carry out surveillance, and build what the FBI was now calling a parallel law enforcement network. His cooperation proved invaluable, and it broke the case wide open. With Stanley's testimony, prosecutors were able to add multiple wire fraud and identity theft charges to the indictment. The full list of crimes being pursued now spanned over a dozen federal statutes. But even with the case advancing, retaliation was still a threat. At one point, someone threw a brick through Mike's cabin window with a note attached that read, "HOA always wins." Of course, it was a hollow threat, but it showed how deep the rot ran. We increased our camera coverage, added motion-triggered floodlights, and began coordinating with our county sheriff for additional patrols. Sarah, always 2 steps ahead, even brought in an old contact from the Bureau's cybersecurity division to sweep our internet access points for bugs or breaches. They found 2, one in a nearby power junction box, and another disguised as a signal repeater camouflaged near a pine tree. Both devices were transmitting data to an IP address linked to a no-defunct HOA vendor company registered in Nevada. The FBI was stunned. "This isn't just corruption," Agent Dawson told us. "This is domestic espionage wrapped in the language of neighborhood governance." He wasn't wrong. Our family had become the nucleus of a case that would soon make national headlines. not just for its legal implications, but for the chilling precedent it was exposing, that private governing bodies, under the guise of community management, were potentially operating as authoritarian regimes, complete with surveillance, enforcement, and extrajudicial tactics. It wasn't just about Margaret anymore. It was about every HOA across the country that ever blurred the line between rules and law, and we were determined to expose them all. As the court date neared, we knew the eyes of the nation would be on us. Journalists from major networks requested exclusive interviews. Civil liberties groups offered to co-sponsor our class action, and even members of Congress began referencing our story as a reason to push for federal oversight of HOA operations. But we hadn't come this far to get distracted by media hype. We wanted justice. And when Sarah stood in front of the federal courthouse steps and gave that first press statement calm, steady, resolute, I felt the full weight of what we had achieved. "This isn't just our fight," she said. "This is every American's fight who's ever been threatened, fined, watched, or harassed by unaccountable neighbors pretending to be police. We don't tolerate tyranny in any form, not in government, not in corporations, and certainly not in HOAs." And just like that, the battle lines were clear. The courthouse was surrounded by press and protesters on the morning the trial began, some holding signs that read "Free our neighborhoods" and "No more HOA tyranny," while others showed up to support Margaret and her cronies, clinging to the idea that everything done was for the order and safety of the community. Sarah and I walked in, flanked by our attorneys, with Agent Dawson nodding to us from the lobby, the federal seal gleaming behind him on the wall. The atmosphere was tense, the kind of tension that doesn't break until someone makes the first mistake. And in this case, Margaret made several. Her legal team, expensive, arrogant, invisibly sweating, tried to suppress key surveillance footage from the cabin, claiming it was obtained without a proper HOA warrant, to which the judge dryly responded that the HOA had no legal authority to issue warrants of any kind, and thus the suppression was denied. When the jury watched the footage of the fake officers trying to enter our property, followed by the quick and shocking intervention of the real FBI agents, there was a collective shift in the room. The prosecution continued to build a devastating case presenting bank records, emails, and witness testimonies, including that of Stanley Finch, who appeared genuinely remorseful as he detailed how Margaret manipulated the board under the guise of community defense. It turned out that the HOA had purchased a fleet of unmarked cars, uniforms, weapons, and even a drone surveillance system using member dues, all funneled through shell corporations with names like Safe Haven Enforcement and Civic Order Consulting. They had essentially built a miniature paramilitary force to patrol and enforce Margaret's version of control over the neighborhood. What shocked even the judge was that none of it was ever reported to local police or approved by the county. One of the most damning pieces of evidence was a recorded call between Margaret and a supplier in Nevada where she said, "I don't care if it's illegal, I want them scared. Fear keeps the lawns mowed." That line became a meme almost instantly, and soon shirts, posters, and even protest chants echoed it ironically throughout the courthouse steps. The defense tried to pivot by arguing Margaret's intentions were misunderstood, that she was merely trying to bring discipline to an otherwise chaotic community. But when another HOA resident testified that she was fined $1,200 for having unauthorized wind chimes, and a different homeowner broke down recounting how fake officers threatened to impound his car for being too dusty, any remaining sympathy evaporated. As the trial dragged into its third week, a surprise witness was brought forward, a former HOA contractor who had worked IT and managed their internal security system. He revealed that not only had the HOA installed facial recognition software without consent, but they had also built a database of resident behaviors, tracking everything from who parked where to who attended which BBQs, especially ours. "We called it the non-compliance index," he testified. "If someone hit too many flags, they'd get visited by security." The cabin BBQ, that was red level, everyone in the courtroom froze. The BBQ was the final trigger, the one where the fake officers were sent, the one where shots were fired. The judge ordered a full 24-hour recess after that day to process the gravity of the testimony. And I remember sitting with Sarah and Mike in our hotel room that night, just stunned. That it had gotten this far from a cabin BBQ to a federal conspiracy? We weren't just dealing with one rogue neighbor. We were uncovering a system so corrupt it had adopted the very worst tactics of authoritarian regimes, all under the camouflage of neighborhood management. The closing arguments were searing. The prosecutor looked directly at the jury and said, "This isn't just about abuse of power. This is about power given to those untrained, unelected, and unchecked. What happens when your neighbor decides they're above the law? You get this?" The jury didn't take long. At the end of the following day, they returned with a unanimous verdict: guilty on all counts. Margaret was sentenced to 35 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole. And several board members received sentences ranging from 10 to 25 years. Depending on their level of involvement, the fallout was massive. The HOA was dissolved by court order, and a federal mandate was issued requiring external oversight of all homeowners associations in the state. It became a national conversation, one that sparked Senate hearings and think pieces in every major outlet. The term HOA Karen evolved from a joke into a serious warning about unchecked suburban power structures. But the story didn't end in court, because the civil side of our plan was just beginning. We and dozens of affected families launched a multi-million-dollar class action lawsuit. It's not just against the defunct HOA, but also against the third-party vendors who had enabled and profited from the corruption. Depositions revealed even more chilling details. Like one vendor who had drafted a proposal to install voice recognition fence monitors that could alert Margaret if unregistered guests were on someone's property. When we won the suit, damages awarded exceeded $60 million. And Sarah insisted every penny be distributed to the families first, especially those who were wrongly fined, surveilled, or threatened. We kept nothing for ourselves. Instead, we founded a legal nonprofit dedicated to fighting HOA abuse nationwide. Within months, we had received over 3,000 requests for help from military veterans fined for flying flags. 2 elderly residents evicted over flower beds. Sarah became the face of the movement, invited to speak at universities, legal symposiums, and public hearings. I returned to practicing law full-time, but made sure our nonprofit had full-time staff, investigators, and a hotline for emergencies. The cabin became more than our safe haven. It became the base of operations for a national movement. We installed a massive fire pit in the backyard where families and volunteers would gather, cook, and share stories. The very thing they tried to destroy. Our freedom to be BBQ, to be with family, to live without fear, became our symbol of victory. And every summer, we hosted what we now call the Liberty Cookout, a weekend retreat for HOA abuse survivors, legal experts, and community leaders. No fake cops, no Karen, just freedom. The first Liberty Cookout after the trial felt like a healing ritual. Over 50 families came to our cabin, many of whom we'd never met but whose lives were deeply affected by similar HOA tyranny. As I flipped burgers with Mike and Sarah past out homemade lemonade, I noticed an older man watching from a distance, hesitant but curious. I walked over, introduced myself, and he smiled politely before saying his name was Earl and that he'd driven across 3 states after seeing our story on the news. He held out a folder. Inside were decades' worth of violation notices from his HOA back home. Petty infractions, a misaligned mailbox, an unauthorized vegetable garden, wind chimes not approved in design, and eventually, forced sale of his house under duress. His hands shook as he said, "I thought I was crazy, but now I know it wasn't me." That moment stuck with me, because it reminded me that even though Margaret was behind bars, there were hundreds of Margarets still out there unchecked, undeterred, and hiding behind the thin veil of HOA regulations to torment anyone who dared step out of line. Over the following months, our legal nonprofit grew faster than we ever imagined. We recruited former prosecutors, constitutional scholars, retired judges, and neighborhood activists. The hotline we set up had to be expanded to handle over 100 calls per day. Cases ranged from the ridiculous a woman fined $5,000 for, Having a pink flamingo in her yard to the horrific, like a man in Arizona who was physically assaulted by his HOA security team after questioning their budget, that's when we knew it was time to take the fight national. Sarah and I worked with state legislators to propose a comprehensive HOA Accountability Act. The bill aimed to enforce transparency, limit fine structures, ban private security operations, and mandate external audits for HOAs operating above a certain budget. Naturally, it faced opposition, particularly from private real estate lobbyists and management companies that profited off the chaos. But the public support was overwhelming. Families came forward on social media with video, evidence, letters, legal filings. The movement had real momentum. Meanwhile, Margaret tried appealing her sentence from prison, alleging political persecution and media bias. But every judge she faced shot down her arguments with increasing irritation. By now, she had become the symbol of what happens when unchecked control festers inside a gated community. But the danger hadn't fully passed. One afternoon, about 6 months after the trial, Mike called us from his cabin. He sounded nervous. "There's a car parked down the hill. Been there all day. Windows tinted." I rushed over with Sarah, armed and cautious, only to find the car gone by the time we arrived. But it wasn't a one-off. Over the next week, both Sarah and I noticed strange activity calls with no voice on the other end, drone sightings. Above our land, and unmarked packages left near our gate, Agent Dawson paid us a visit and confirmed what we feared. Some of the vendors tied to Margaret's network still had active assets, and it appeared someone was trying to intimidate us into silence. But if anything, it made us dig in harder. We doubled security around the cabin and relocated all legal documents and client data to encrypted cloud servers. We even hired former federal agents to advise our nonprofit on threat assessment. Still, one night the tension reached its peak. I woke up to the sound of tires crunching gravel. I looked out and saw 2 men with flashlights approaching the main house. Sarah was already awake, pistol in hand, and Mike was at the back door with his shotgun. We followed protocol and called the FBI before making any moves. As the figures stepped into the light, we shouted warnings, but they kept advancing. Just as we braced for confrontation, headlights flashed behind them and 3 black SUVs tore down the path. The men froze, and agents swarmed them in seconds. They weren't just loiterers. They were former private contractors hired by a disbanded HOA consulting firm that had profited from Margaret's regime. They were armed, wearing tactical vests, and had blueprints of our property. It was a planned hit, cloaked under the plausible deniability of security consulting. The FBI took them into custody, and within days, more arrests followed. At least 6 other individuals connected to a larger HOA corruption ring spanning 3 states. The public exploded again. It was no longer a local story. We were looking at a national criminal enterprise hiding behind the benign-sounding title of Homeowners Association. The next morning, as the sun rose behind the cabin and the smell of pine filled the air, Sarah and I stood by the porch in silence. Our little cabin, once just a peaceful retreat, had become the epicenter of a legal revolution. "They came after the wrong family," Sarah whispered. And she was right, because every move they made only exposed more of their rot. We worked with national media outlets to produce a full-length documentary on the HOA underground enforcement economy, interviewing victims, whistleblowers, and agents like Dawson. The film aired to millions, prompting the Department of Justice to establish a special task force for HOA-related crime. State after state introduced reform bills. Laws changed, people fought back, and every time someone tried to silence us, we just got louder. At the next Liberty Cookout, Earl brought a dozen folders from other victims he'd helped organize into a class action. "You started something," he told me, grinning with pride. "Now it's rolling." We never expected that a cabin BBQ would lead to all this, to courtrooms, documentaries, death threats, and legislative victories. But that's what happens when you push good people too far. We never sought conflict. We just wanted peace, privacy, a meal with family. But if the cost of that peace is letting tyrants roam unchecked behind the banner of community rules, then peace isn't peace at all. It's submission. We're not the submitting type. The following year passed in waves of trials, waves of healing, and waves of support from across the country. Our once small nonprofit had evolved into a powerful national watchdog organization known as Citizens Against Board Rule Abuse. We had a network of attorneys, activists, whistleblowers, and community organizers working around the clock to fight against rogue HOAs and their shady enforcement arms. Sarah began leading monthly workshops on homeowners' rights, while Mike managed outreach and built coalitions with lawmakers and victims across rural and suburban America. Even Agent Dawson, after retiring from the Bureau, joined our board as Director of Investigations. The government task force we had helped inspire began issuing indictments in nearly every region, exposing a vast network of HOA management companies that had been laundering money, hiring ex-mercenaries as security consultants, and operating like miniature totalitarian regimes within gated communities. Margaret, despite being behind bars, had become a cautionary tale. One afternoon, just as spring returned to the mountain, Mike received a call from a woman named Renee in a gated Florida suburb. Her husband had been assaulted by an HOA-hired security team when he refused to allow them into their backyard for an inspection. Her voice trembled as she described the bruises, the legal threats, the cover-up. It felt like déjà vu. We flew out the next morning, and what we found confirmed our worst fears. The same type of unauthorized uniforms, the same contractor hood. Once worked with Margaret, it's the same network, just rebranded and relocated. CABRA filed an injunction the next day, working with federal agents to intercept emails, invoices, and backdoor communications. The investigation blew open another underground enforcement operation, one with ties to private prisons, debt collection agencies, and even former political figures who had lobbied for increased HOA power over the years. We documented everything, presented it at a national conference in D.C., and used the spotlight to demand sweeping federal reform. That week, the HOA Federal Oversight Act passed its first reading in Congress. Back at the cabin, life found rhythm again. Hall where we hosted monthly dinners, legal Q&As, and campfire nights for families. Every evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, the smell of barbecue once again filled the air not with tension or fear, but with celebration. People came not to mourn their losses, but to claim their victories and honor their resilience. One evening, I spotted a boy no older than 10 standing near the edge of the field, staring at a plaque we had recently installed. It read, "In memory of those silenced, in honor of those who spoke, and in defense of every American's right to peace in their own home." The boy turned and asked, "Did they really send fake cops?" It knelt beside him and said, "Yes, but they didn't win." That's the legacy we were building, not just for ourselves, but for future generations who shouldn't have to fear the very communities they call home. We also launched a digital HOA abuse registry where residents could anonymously report misconduct, enabling investigations without putting themselves at risk. Within the first 6 months, we logged over 8,000 verified entries. Several led to arrests. Others led to mass resignations of corrupt boards. We partnered with tech firms to create an AI-powered tool that analyzed HOA documents for predatory clauses, helping new buyers avoid getting trapped. As the movement grew, so did the pushback. We were sued 6 times in 1 year by different HOA conglomerates trying to shut us down. We won every case. One HOA executive even offered us a large settlement to retire quietly. We declined and leaked the email. By then, even late-night comedy shows were roasting overreaching HOAs, while journalists referred to us as the Backyard Justice League. Never forget the moment Congress voted to pass the HOA Federal Oversight Act into law. We were sitting on the porch with Mike and Sarah, watching the vote on a laptop. When the final count came in, we didn't cheer. We just looked at each other and let the quiet settle in. We knew it wasn't the end of the war, but it was a solid victory. In a battlefield where the odds were once stacked against ordinary people, later that night, a neighbor arrived with a homemade pie and a simple thank you note that read, "You saved our home." That's what it had always been about. Not power, not politics, just people. People who wanted to live without being bullied. For the color of their shutters, the height of their grass, or the angle of their fence. People who wanted to gather, to barbecue, to live and love and breathe freely on land they paid for. The story of the cabin BBQ wasn't just about a confrontation. It was about a reckoning. It reminded the country that tyranny doesn't always wear a badge. It sometimes hides behind clipboards and bylaws. But no matter how it dresses, it must always be confronted. Because when good people say nothing, bad rules become law. But when good people stand together, even fake cops get exposed, and even the most untouchable boards fall. There, and your HOA thinks they own your land, your time, your peace. Remember this, you're not alone. The fight is real, but so is the victory. And it all started with a cabin, a grill, and a family who said no more. If this story moved you, if you've lived a similar nightmare, or if you just believe in standing up to injustice, then hit that subscribe button now and join us at Sham Stories. Your voice matters, your story matters. And together, we're louder than any HOA rulebook.